Now here comes finally the lecture on creativity. And when you're actually looking at creativity, what we are really talking about is, by most definitions, we're talking about creating something that is deemed new and valuable. And there is actually one scientist who has given us a quote on that. This is Mumford. And he said that creativity should result in the production of novel and useful products. So Mumford is one person to read up on if you want to get into creativity in a bigger way. And there is this notion that it's only creative when you can prove that it has never before existed in the world. The way we tend to be able to do that best in industry is by having a patent, for example. Just a quick check question here. Are you now seeing another slide than you did when I started?
Yes.
Wonderful. So this is actually rolling. Great. Thank you. And this is only important to point out because there are those who think that creativity may not need to be historically new to the world, but that it can also be creative when you've made something that is new to the person who has made it and to the people around them. So clearly, when you have a child and they're making something that they have never made before, then that is actually a creative act. And it's also a creative act if grandmother has never seen it before. So that whole thing about, does it have to be historically new to the world, or is it enough if only a certain person hasn't seen it yet? That's a big debate that's going on in creativity and in society as well, because people disagree on this a lot. We have actually seen proof of creativity in animals. So it's not just us humans who can be creative. We see that, for example, monkeys have an ability to use tools, and it's not just monkeys. There are all sorts of animals that are using objects to get stuff done. Monkeys were just the first ones we noticed it in. There's another side of animal creativity that is hotly debated. You see the painting elephants of Thailand, for example, and it's a bit of a sad reality, that one, because these elephants aren't painting because they feel inspired or they want to create a painting. These elements have been trained to conduct certain movements with an object. So there is a fine line between a monkey deciding that a stick is going to get them fruits down from a tree that they otherwise couldn't reach, and quite a different story than when you have a poor elephant who has been through a lot to paint elephant portraits. Now, there's this author, Liane Gabora, who said that actually it is only creativity that can ever produce a culture. So with that, we're saying that without creativity, we couldn't actually have culture. Creativity creates culture. That's a concept that a lot of cultural scientists are hanging on to these days. And we also see this in economics. Like, for example, in economics, you will often have the term ingenuity. In industry, for example, people are talking about ingenuity being there and being worth a lot of money. And it is in industry then, and in economics, simply the ability to come up with new ideas. They have a different word for that also. They call this individual capital. So this goes to show you how highly valued that actually is in industry or in economics in general, when you have individuals who are able to be ingenious and come up with their own ideas, things that are not known already, things that are not imitation. We can measure creativity. Here's a world map that shows us how densely populated the world is. So here we see where the people are on this planet. The more red it is, the more people we see. Now, wouldn't it be nice if that map also meant that that is also where the most creative stuff happens? Yeah, the redder it is, the more creative stuff happens, but it isn't like that. We actually see that there are quite a few places in the world that are not creative at all, or very, very little only, even though there are a lot of people there. Now we have a map that shows how creative places in the world are. And it's this. This is a map that indicates the so-called Bohemian Gay Creativity Index. Now, that is one very astonishing notion that I only stumbled upon by reading all this. And as you can see here, the darker the shade is, the stronger that creativity index is. And I'll talk a little more about that Bohemian Gay Index because it's fascinating. So we can clearly see here in the world that it is actually the wealthy nations that are being particularly creative. That's an interesting fact, I thought. Now, a few more words about the Gay Bohemian Index. Someone, and I have to admit, I still don't know who, came up with this theory that gay people and bohemian people, bohemians being, you know, artsy types, tend to gravitate towards areas that somehow later become very wealthy. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the fact that they have gone there is turning the place wealthy. We don't know that, but we see that with certain places in the world that have a very strong gay community. Vancouver, San Francisco, London, just to name a very few of them. Once you see the gay community building up and the bohemian community building up in these places, a huge influx of money follows. So this is a phenomenon that creativity scientists have been following for decades now. And it's a very strange thing and a useful thing, I think, to predict which places in the world are going to be creative places, money-making places. We have a statistic here that shows this. Now, I really hope you can read that, but it is probably a bit too small for it. So I'm going to interpret it for you. This ranks the most creative places in the world. And we know that there are over 200 countries on this planet. So what we are seeing here is only the top 10. And the top 10 most creative countries in the world is still dominated by places like Sweden, which is #1 in the world for creativity, the United States, Finland, Denmark, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So perhaps with the exception of the United States, these are all really mellow countries where anxiety about life is low, where you're able to take risks without having to fear that you're going to starve in the street if it goes badly. And the further down you go, the less cushy these places perhaps are, but they're still pretty nice to live in. So we are seeing some really wealthy countries here where life is good. This is called the Technology Talent Tolerance ranking, if you're ever looking for that, or the Global Creativity Index. It changes a little bit every year, but not a lot. I find that places maybe go up and down, maybe 6, 7 ranks every year, depending on what's going on there. But you'll see that this list pretty much stands. There is another way to measure how creative someone or something is. Malcolm Gladwell gave us a thing called the divergence test. The divergence test, I think, is a very simple one to do. You give people 2 rows of words, a noun and an adjective, and then you ask them to put the 2 together. Now, a person with a so-called convergent profile, as pictured here, kind of a boring, normal person, would put the most logical things together. Like that person might say that we could say that a crocodile is probably stupid. Good. So we have a convergent profile person, but are they creative? No. It's a very common assessment, I think, that a crocodile is probably stupid. And then we have people with a divergent profile, which we see here, and they might come up with something completely out of the blue, like, no, the crocodile is mild. It's a mild crocodile. And then they'll launch into an explanation of how and why. And then, you know, no, this is clearly a creative person because they chose something that's really obtuse and just not common. So that's the divergence test by Malcolm Gladwell. It basically shows you just how unexpected or how weird or how strange an answer is. And the stranger it is, the more creative the answer probably is. There's another one of these tests called the Psychometric Creativity Test by Guilford. And that one actually measures how common an answer is and then assesses how creative the person is. So we have these two smiley faces here in the middle as the object of the test. And then we ask two test people, pictured here to the left and to the right, what sort of image we see here, what that image represents. Now we will have person A saying, yeah, round stuff is what we are looking at here. And you can see here in the graph that they did not score very well on uncommonness. Now we're going to ask the person on the right here what they think. And they come back with the answer that what we are seeing here in these smiley faces are actually Uruguayan guerrillas in disguise. Now, wow, that is one crazy weird answer, and it's very uncommon because you won't hear a lot of people say that. So we can say that the person on the right here is clearly very creative, whereas the person on the left isn't, because the person on the left only said something very common sense. We have yet another way of testing or measuring creativity. This comes from Torrance, and it's just called the Torrance test of creativity, probably used by psychiatrists to assess people. And they use these three different parameters. They measure the fluency, for example, with which creativity or outcomes are being created. So that means they're looking at just how easily can a person come up with lots of different solutions to something. Or the so-called originality. Just how often do you ever see a solution like that? But here, this is a lunchbox where you can transport a heart in if you happen to have one. It could also just be a normal lunchbox that is heart-shaped, but hey, that's weird. And that is therefore very original because you don't see a lot of that often. I'm not sure. Have you seen that often? I have not. And then there's another aspect to it, and that is the so-called elaboration. So when somebody creates a new idea, just how much detail do they give you on that idea? How often has it happened to you that you're reading a science fiction novel and then actually it doesn't quite capture you because the author doesn't go very deeply into a description of the spaceship and what sort of coffee it has in the coffee machine and all those things. And you want to hear those things. So the more detail your author or designer gives you, the more creative they probably are, because each one of these details requires creativity as such as well. And then we have lots of these kinds of things here. The social personality approach in measuring creativity is made up of these 5 elements here, called independence of judgment, self-confidence, attraction to complexity, aesthetic orientation, and risk-taking. So with these 5, we have basically grasped the so-called social personality approach to measuring creativity. And this has been written by a man named Gregory Feist, who basically claims that creative people are easily recognized because they do a number of typical things. For example, a creative person is typically open to new experiences. These are people who will gladly try something they haven't tried before. They may be less conventional, which means that they may do things in ways that you don't expect. They will be less conscientious as well, which is good news for all us sloppy people who, like me, really sometimes don't care about stuff. For example, I'm covered in cat hair here, if you haven't seen that. So I'm very unconscientious about the fact that I'm going into a lecture here full of cat hair. That's what creative people do. We don't care what we look like. Let's get the stuff done. Creative people also tend to be a lot more self-confident than others. So they just believe in themselves and go do it. It also means that they're self-accepting. So a creative person is often someone who goes, yeah, that's how I am, you know. And they don't question themselves very much. It's just like, this is how I am and this is how I do my things. They will be driven, which you can recognize by them having endless energy to do something over and over and over again. This is Gollum, in case you haven't seen Lord of the Rings. He's a little person who's always trying to find the ring to, I don't know, what was it again? That ring can do something, yeah. And he's driven to find it. Another thing creative people tend to be is ambitious. So they're not very easygoing, and this probably flies in the face of many stereotypes, because artists and designers are often seen as very mellow people who are probably smoking a lot of pot. But actually, it isn't entirely like that. Well, you might be smoking pot and still be ambitious, who knows? But this is a key characteristic of a creative person, that they're trying to do one better. They may also be dominant people, so creative people may not always be so easy to live with, because they'll try to tell you how to do your stuff, and that they need space, and that they need to, you know, have an extra room to do their things in, and so on. So they might throw their weight around, and they could be downright hostile. A creative person is more likely to tell you no than a person who is not creative. So if somebody is saying no to you a lot, it only means they might have their own ideas and are therefore perhaps creative. And they may very well also be quite impulsive, because if you have a lot of ideas all the time, well, you jump around a lot. You always have a new thing to try. So they're impulsive. When we go back in history a little bit, we observe another strange thing, and that is that the face of creativity, the appearance of creativity, and the character of it has changed a lot. As we humans have evolved, even just for the past few thousand years, which hasn't seen any, or yeah, maybe very little change in physicality, we have completely rewritten what creativity actually means to us, and how we manifest it. So when we're going through these typical old pieces of art that we find, for example, 3,000-4,000 years ago in China, as pictured here, or 2,000-3,000 years ago in Greece, as pictured here, we see something that could be described as art imitating life. It just means that when someone was being creative back then, all they had to do was show things as they were. You know, draw a person, model a person. That was enough to be considered creative. And you see that all over the world. Creativity back then meant depicting reality as it was. Then came the Middle Ages, with an infusion of, let's call it idealism. You suddenly had images showing up where people were trying to sell you something in a way. So I'm saying selling you something, but they weren't actually trying to sell you something. They were trying to show how wonderful certain things were. They were trying to make you like certain things, or at least have respect for them. You might have had images like these that are showing life at royal court. So they're showing the king and showing how beautiful the king is and how wonderful the tablecloth was that they were eating from, to celebrate authority. And that included religious themes. So they were beginning to use art to glorify figures of authority. That was the Middle Ages. And then came the Renaissance, which was incredibly sick of that nonsense and started depicting ideals. And it was not just ideals. No, I said that wrong. It was not just ideals, but it was not at all ideals of authority, but it was ideals of people. They called it ideals of great men, but I mean, clearly they weren't into emancipation at the time yet, so they didn't understand that there could also be great women. But let's leave it at that. And the thing with the Renaissance was that they were a step beyond the whole authority celebration thing. They were like no longer, okay, the deity is great and all the angels are great and the king is great. No, now they were beginning to show that that which humanity was able to produce was great, and that there were wonderful pieces of architecture that could be created with mathematics, and that that wisdom and education and actually spending time with information was a good thing to do, as we see here in this image of all these philosophers hanging around a place where they could philosophize. Now, the Renaissance was, of course, nothing to do with the time that is shown here. We have a depiction of antiquity here, when actually the Renaissance was in the 1700s. And then we fast forward to the 19th century, the 1800s, where we suddenly saw something slightly different. We did see what might have been reality, hyper-reality. It was too much reality for comfort. Artists began to depict and criticize people for how they looked. So we are seeing not an ideal at all here in this image. This is probably a very realistic rendition of what it was like to live in the 19th century. So you had a mess on the floor, you had weird drapes in the background, the place was full of kids, people were at times old, people were at times not looking so great. It was, you know, the mess as life actually is. So people began to discover art and creativity as a way of saying, hey, not all is well around us, you know. And that then escalated in the 20th century into something even more interesting, and that was that art and creativity began to challenge all values. So we had this type of paintings popping up where, sorry, I'll take a sip of water. Yeah, where artists were basically saying, hey, you know, forget perspective, forget objects. Let's just create something that doesn't actually conform to all those things that we're so used to. Let's completely leave the universe that we know behind and see what it would look like if none of these things existed. And I think we're very much still in that at the moment. Now, if you want to read up on a few more people who have written interesting stuff about creativity, we have these four here. And I've also quickly summarized what they're actually thinking and saying about the role of creativity. Now, Thomas Hobbs was probably the first one who ever started writing about creativity. And in his opinion, imagination, which is a key element of creativity, of course, is a key element of human cognition. So this caused a bit of a stir when he wrote that, because at the time when he did, nobody had given that any thought yet. Next came William Duff, who introduced the concept of a genius. So the genius was someone who was able to use his imagination to be both productive and innovative. So a genius would be someone who keeps churning out results and results and results. And they were things that the world had not seen before, so they were innovative. That was William Duff's definition of a genius and of creativity. Francis Galton defined this a little further a little later and boiled it down to the very compact notion that if you're going to have a genius in front of you, then this would simply be a person who is able to create originally, which means that that is the one person who is the origin of an idea and there is no previous notion of it. And then there are these two people, Hermann von Helmholtz and Henri Poincaré, who introduced the concept that creative processes can only ever work with lots and lots of reflection, which is another thing that nobody had thought about, that you don't have to shoot from the hip as a creative person. You don't have to just suddenly come up with something out of the blue as if it were some sort of revelation to a holy person. But no, it is a process, and it is a process where you are thinking about things perhaps for a very long time over and over again, and then finally you get an idea for a new thing. Right, and now we're taking it to this very well-known author. I have a row of authors here and what they're saying. That's my service to you. I've read these people, and now I'm going to give you just a shortcut to what they actually say. Wallace had this interesting 5-stage model of creative insights and illuminations. You can tell by the way it's written that he is one of the classics of creativity. And he said basically that when you're going through a creative process, you're going through these 5 steps here as they're listed. You will be going through preparation, incubation, intimation, illumination, and then verification. So lots of Asians. And the first one simply means when you're preparing yourself to become creative, you're focusing your mind, you're beginning to understand the dimensions of the problem that you're trying to solve. And then you're making it yours. You're doing a so-called incubation. You're, you know the term incubation period, right? It's like the length of time a virus requires till you get sick. And that's pretty much the idea with this, that there's an incubation period also until you can actually start being creative about something. So you've prepared yourself, you've begun to understand the dimensions of the problem, and then you're letting it sizzle for a while until it does something with you and it becomes yours to do stuff with. And then you're getting into it. So you might be sitting in an office at that point, creating a mess with the cat to try out maybe different kinds of solutions. And finally, the best one will become clear to you as you might have tried different ones. And you might try them out. So the final stage is then the verification. Once your idea has become reality, you are using it, and we're just all going to see how good it is in the long run. That's called the verification. By Wallace, that is. Then we have these two, Kaufman and Beghetto. And they shortened it down a little bit, and they only have the 4 C's. Actually, no, I'm misguiding you here. They didn't shorten anything down. They have a completely different model to offer here. So this is not a process we're looking at, but this is a system of classification, if you will. For Kaufman and Beghetto, there are only 4 different types of creativity called the 4 C's. The first one, the mini C, is the typical Facebook post. You have a person standing in front of a sunset in a tutu, if you will, and what they're showing there is a little bit creative, no doubt. You know, somebody has said, this is a nice picture. I like the colors and the shades. We'll take that photo of you there in Tahiti on the beach with your ballet skirt. And but it's only a little personally meaningful interpretation of an experience. And that's clearly what a Facebook selfie is, for example, or other photos we see there. Then we have a slightly larger C, a slightly larger creativity, that is. It's called the little c, and that would be everyday problem solving, where we see how people maybe improvise to solve little problems. Yeah, do you take your kids to the kindergarten first, or do you go shopping first? This is little c. This is everyday problem solving. Now we're getting into the professional side. And here we're saying, okay, there is such a thing as professional creativity. And that is an interesting notion in itself, because there are a lot of people who think that creativity is talent and you have to be born with it and all. But a lot of creativity scientists have actually proven that that is not the case, and that you can totally be creative and professional at the same time. So you can force yourself to be creative. That's yet another thing that isn't even happening here in this lecture yet. Forced creativity. We could maybe do a forced creativity exercise one day if you like. It's a very easy way to be creative without actually being a creative person, if you don't consider yourself one. And that also, of course, has a big brother or sister, which is the big C, the big creativity. And that would be when you have somebody who is professionally creative, doing particularly well at it. Like the person pictured here, this is Buckminster Fuller, the person who gave us the geodesic structure, which is the weird bubble in the background. And he also created this incredible car, the Dymaxion, if you haven't heard of it. Now we're talking way back 100 years ago, when cars looked very much like horse-drawn carriages without the horses. And he created this drop-shaped vehicle that could do an unbelievable speed at a very good fuel economy. And unfortunately, it crashed tragically and 3 people died. So they didn't take it any further. But it was a good idea when they started with it. Anyway, these are Kaufman and Piketty's 4 C's for the classification of creativity, just so that you know what that is. Now we have that other person here, Margaret Bouden. And Margaret Bouden is the one whose example I already showed at the start, the one who gave us the notion that there would be such a thing as personal creativity and historical creativity. Personal creativity being when you do something for the first time, maybe because you're 3 years old and somebody gave you a pen and suddenly you have drawn a unicorn. And that's amazing, even though many unicorns have been drawn before in the history of the world, but you wouldn't know that. And then there is the historical creativity, which actually does take into account that many unicorns have been drawn. So you don't, you draw something else. Maybe you draw a unicorn with 3 horns. So it's what's a unicorn with 1? Well, whatever, this is philosophy. You get the concept. Margaret Bouden says that there are 2 types of creativity. One is personal and one is official or historical. Now, these were people and their views, eminent people, if I may say so. But now we can also look into theories around the creative processes itself. So when you are being creative, when you're doing creative things, what actually happens there? Now we have these different, these 4 different theories that are in the ether on that. And so we have the creative cognition approach, we have the explicit-implicit interaction theory, and then we have the conceptual blending and the honing theory. So that's what they're called, if you want to read up on those ever. And this is what they look like. I've tried to visualize them a little bit. The creative cognition approach looks a bit like this. You have a phase where you're brainstorming, if you will. So this is the so-called generative phase. And it has so-called pre-inventive structures, which means we haven't invented anything yet, but we are on our way to doing so. And out of that mess somehow comes an idea in the end. Then there's this crazy thing, the explicit-implicit interaction theory. And it basically means that you will always have two elements that are going to be communicating with each other within a certain time frame, which puts pressure on it and a motivation. And then they will somehow come together, combine everything, integrate everything together, and make something out of it. Then you have this thing, the so-called conceptual blending, which I think is most likely to be used by artificial intelligence in the not too distant future. And just basically means that you have two frames of reference or two aspects, and you put them together and bingo, you have created a thing that wasn't there before. So that's called conceptual blending. And then you have the honing theory, which is in a way nothing but the idea of feedback loops. So we are saying that nothing only ever comes out creative in one go. You go over and over and over the same thing, and time goes by, and eventually it becomes something. So those were theories around creative processes, if you ever have to write about that. One question that sometimes pops up is, does it tell us how intelligent someone is when they're creative? Do you have to be crazy intelligent to be able to be creative? And different scientists have different ideas on that, but I think they pretty much go in one direction. So we have Barron, Guilford, and Wallach and Kogan, who are saying, no, we can actually not state scientifically that there's actually a correlation between creativity and intelligence. So they found out pretty early on in the game that it doesn't tell you how creative someone is if they're also very intelligent, and it doesn't tell you how intelligent someone is if they are very creative. They can be crazy creative or crazy intelligent without being the other. Now, Perkins came with this thing, the so-called nothing special hypothesis, which he thinks states that creativity actually is an intelligence type, or is a kind of intelligence that creates an unusual outcome. So to Perkins, creativity is actually a kind of intelligence. It isn't intelligence as a whole, but it's an aspect of intelligence. And then finally, we have Torrance, who says that creativity does require intelligence, but if you are intelligent, it doesn't mean that you are also creative. And I think that that is perhaps the most realistic way of putting it, because the fact is, if you don't know anything, and if you can't come to any conclusions, then you wouldn't be able to be creative, would you? But then you get these people who are incredibly intelligent, and they get it, and they understand whatever you're saying before you've even finished. But they can be the most boring people who never have an idea of their own. So that's totally that. Those were the different thoughts on that. And then we have an interesting psychologist here, Schmidhuber, and he had this thought. Now, why do we have this ability to be creative as humans at all? Why on earth is this even part of us? And he found out in his studies that creative people, they're not just innocent creatives who like drawing flowers and creating statues. It's not like that. They actually get something out of it. They have they get a reward out of it, and that is a social reward. It's very commonly observable that creativity is at its peak when also sexual performance is at its peak. So there's a direct connection, according to Schmidhuber, between creativity and sexuality. You're basically and it's very, very mostly a male thing, that they're using creativity and their ability to wow people and make people laugh to get the attention of women, right? So that is one psychological illumination of what creativity has as a as a purpose, if you will, for us humans. And he, by the way, also found out that creative people tend to be much more interested in open-ended things that have no known pathway. Personally, I'm considering myself a very creative person, and I am, for example, somebody who absolutely hates playing games because they have rules. I can't be creative with a card game. I have to stick to the rules. So that's a trademark of creative people, that they enjoy things that are not finished because it perhaps gives them an opportunity to finish it their way. And since we've gone into psychology, we might as well go into neurobiology now and see if there's anything happening in our body and in our brains that makes people creative or not. And there is. You can actually do a biopsy or probably an autopsy on a person and find out if they are or were creative just by checking out their bodies. Now, these elements here are, of course, not something you could check physically. A high level of specialized knowledge. That's just something that creative people normally have, because if you know your stuff and if you know what exists in the world regarding your field, you can, of course, be creative about it. But this is something that can be measured biologically in the body. Creative people are capable of so-called frontal lobe divergent thinking. So you could put a person through a CAT scanner and see what happens when they think. And creative people will have that part of the brain light up quite a lot more than others, because they are able to modulate a neurotransmitter called, I can't pronounce this thing, norepinephrine or some such thing. Anyway, there is a chemical substance that is released when creative people think, and that can be measured too. Let's look around a little bit in other cultures and how they interpret creativity. Sorry, my voice is beginning to leave here. So I've looked around a little bit, and I have lived in 10 countries. So this observation is more of a personally inclined one. In the United States, my impression was that creativity is usually attributed to people who have skills. So to be a creative person or be considered a creative person in the United States, you'd have to demonstrate a clearly visible skill that you have. Perhaps you're an amazing musician, or perhaps you are a famous designer, or perhaps you have created a product that didn't exist before. So that would be the American interpretation of creativity, I think. And in China, and this has actually been scientifically verified through surveys, it is interestingly often considered creative to be an authority figure. So in China, there's this interesting correlation between authority and creativity. It's almost as if only an authoritative person is ever capable of being creative, because they're at the top of the pyramid and everybody else is busy working towards that person's aims and goals. So when Chinese participants were asked in a study to point out the most creative person, they actually all said, "Oh, that's Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao was the most creative person." And of course, when you live in China and when you've brought up there, it's sort of the logical thing to always say Chairman Mao is tops on everything. So there might have been a little bit of that in that outcome. Still, it does show quite clearly how they handle creativity, and not just in China, but I've also noticed this in Japan. The higher up you are in the hierarchy of a design company, for example, the more you get to decide how stuff is done. That's how hierarchies are. But the interesting thing is that in Japanese design culture, that is also the top people who do this. I mean, the actual designing is happening by just a few people at the top. And that would be the location of creativity in Asian culture, I think. Here in Scandinavia, I've found that there's an unafraidness of addressing the real problems in life. So I think Scandinavian creativity is very pragmatic, very reality oriented, and creates things that make life better. Whereas in Germany, I find that they almost put on a voluntary filter on themselves, where they say, oh, it's only creative if it can be used by everybody and if it works every time. So the Germans are sort of a little caught in between being scientific and wanting to be very social about their creativity. I think that that can actually hold them back, but well, it's a challenge as well. So this was just a little illumination there on cultures. Now, you may be one of these people who are of the opinion that they're not creative enough. It is a reality of working life that every now and then we have to come up with an idea. And maybe some of us find that hard, and it can be hard. So are there ways in which we could make ourselves more creative, or in which we at least could make ourselves perform more creatively? Now, there is a thing here that I think could totally do this. It's made by a man named Nickerson, and it's the so-called list of creative attributes by Nickerson. So to become more creative, we could, for example, establish a more clear purpose and intention of what we want to do. That's just the starting point. We're like, okay, we have a goal. That's number one. Then we might need to build some skills, because the fact is, the more skills you have, the more stuff you can do. And that can then mean that perhaps you will be able to be creative because you have skills. You could also become a bit more of a specialist. They call that encouraging acquisitions of domain-specific knowledge. They're basically saying, become a nerd, and you might just become creative. Know something very specialized. Read up on it. We could also try to stimulate and reward curiosity and exploration. Now, that's not something we can do with ourselves, but if we have children, we could do it with them. And I personally have always found that kids who grew up, for example, with boring toys were often a lot more creative than kids who grew up with interesting toys, because those interesting toys don't actually give you a lot of freedom to try stuff and make it something it's not supposed to be, you know. So that aspect is perhaps important in childhood. And then there's got to be some sort of motivation to actually be creative. I've always wanted to read a book, to write a book, for example, but I have no motivation to write a book, because yeah, I could sit down and write 1,000 pages and then nobody will want to read it, right? So it would really help me if I knew some editor who said, you know, Chris, you really should write a book. Have 20 pages on my desk by next week. How about that? I would totally do it. But as it is, nobody's asking me to, so I have no motivation. You can, if you're a team leader, for example, try to encourage your team to take risks. Trust in yourselves, team, and you know, put forward a crazy proposal. And that can bring up the creativity in the company just a little bit, maybe. You could also, on a personal level, focus on what they call mastery and self-competition. So you're saying, okay, here's this thing I want to get good at, and I'm going to keep doing it until I'm very, very good at it. And it's very likely that in the process of doing so, you're going to discover all sorts of new ways of doing things, either for yourself or for the world. And there you go. You have made yourself more creative. You will, of course, also have to involve other people when you're doing creative stuff. So it's important that they will support you in your desire to become more creative. So you have to have a sort of supportable belief about creativity, such as it's worth it for me to become more creative because I could perhaps in my field then do more to save the world if I am a recycling specialist, for example. So a creative recycling specialist is going to be able to do a lot more for the world than one who isn't. And that's a very supportable belief, actually, because it makes sense. Another thing you can do to make yourself more creative is when you're creating a solution, force yourself to create more than one. Why not have 3 or 4? I usually ask this of my industrial design students. I never want to see just one proposal for how to solve a problem. No, I want to see at least 3, maybe 4. And it forces you basically to consider other ways, different perspectives, other criteria that might be interesting. And there you go. Already you have made your creativity 4 times as prolific as before. You would need to have a bit of discipline, of course, to actually pull through with something creative. So a bit of self-management skills might help. And then there is the simple fact that there actually are acknowledged techniques and strategies that you can learn to increase your creative performance. There's all sorts of creativity training out there, and much of it works. Just take a few classes in that. And then I think finally it's important to always keep in mind that there is a certain balance to creativity. It's not just, it's not really true that there has got to be a new solution every time to do something. The old solutions are manifestations of previous creativity as well, and they may have every right to live if you look at how they were developed. So take it with a grain of salt with this whole creativity thing. Just because it's new doesn't always mean that it's better than what already exists. Yeah, and that was all I had for the day. I hope you're still conscious. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but the great thing with a recording is that you can actually scroll forward and backward and look for things again if you want to. And you have my voiceover as an explanation as well. So I hope that was useful. And I thank you for your attention. There. Thank you.
Have you